You stand in the ruins of a temple, where silence presses against your skin like a weight. The desert wind moans through broken pillars, carrying the sting of limestone dust into your throat. Before you, a procession of men with hammers and chisels ascends wooden scaffolds. They do not chant prayers, nor offer sacrifices. They are here for something darker. The first strike rings out, metal against stone. Sparks leap. Another blow follows, and then another, until the air trembles with a chorus of destruction. A face once carved to last eternity shatters into fragments. The eyes, once meant to look upon the sun forever, collapse into dust beneath their tools. The lips, sculpted to speak divinity into being, are smashed into silence. The chisels move to the walls, clawing away at hieroglyphs, tearing the very name of a king from the world. This is not vandalism. It is execution, a ritual murder of memory. In ancient Egypt, there was no punishment more terrifying than this: to be stripped of your name, your image, your afterlife, to suffer a death so complete that even the gods would not recognize you. And yet, the victim of this punishment is no traitor, no foreign invader. It is Pharaoh himself, Egypt's chosen of the gods, the son of Ra, reduced to an unperson. His city lies abandoned. His god is banished. His image is hunted down like prey. Why? What could a king do to deserve erasure so violent that 3,000 years later, his story still whispers like a curse through shattered stone? You will see soon enough. For this was no ordinary ruler. He was the heretic who defied the gods of Egypt, the visionary who tried to rebuild the world in the image of the sun, and the man who crossed a boundary so abhorrent, even the ancients recoiled in horror. This is the story of the Pharaoh who wed his own daughters. He was not always the cursed king whose name was carved out of stone. Once he was a boy, Amenhotep, son of Egypt's golden age. He was born into a kingdom swollen with wealth and triumph. The empire stretched from the deep gold mines of Nubia to the cedar forests of Lebanon, from the rich fields of the Nile to the banks of the Euphrates. Egypt was not just a land. It was the center of the known world. At its heart stood the god Ammonius, enthroned in temples that rose like man-made mountains. Karnak alone held estates vast enough to rival kingdoms, its priesthood commanding legions of servants and soldiers, its treasuries bursting with tribute from conquered lands. The priests of Ammonius were not mere holy men. They were a power to match the throne itself, a hidden empire within the empire. Any child born to Egypt's royal house would have been expected to grow beneath the shadow of this ancient god, molded into a defender of the faith that had endured for 3,000 years. But this child was different. Amenhotep IV was long-limbed, with narrow shoulders and a face that seemed stretched by unseen hands. His skull, elongated and strange, drew whispers even among the palace servants. His eyes lingered too long on the horizon, on the rising sun, as though searching for a voice in the dawn. Tutors trained him in the rituals of kingship, writing the sacred signs, commanding the bow, reciting the hymns of Ammonius. Yet beneath the lessons something stirred. He looked beyond the chants of the priests, beyond the crowded pantheon of gods, to the solitary blaze of the sun itself. Some said it was madness. Others called it vision. But even as a youth, Amenhotep seemed less a child of the old gods and more a vessel for something new, something dangerous. It was from this strange boy that the heretic king would one day emerge. If you've made it this far into Curse Chronicles and still haven't subscribed, ask yourself, why? You're already deep in forbidden history, so don't just lurk in the shadows. Subscribe and claim your place among us. When the young king finally took the throne, Egypt expected him to walk the ancient path of his fathers, to honor Ammonius, Lord of Thrones, to kneel in the great courts of Karnak, where columns soared like petrified forests and priests ruled with voices louder than armies. But the boy who gazed too long at the sun had no intention of bowing. At first the change was subtle. Temples still smoked with incense, sacrifices still bled at the altars, but new shrines began to rise. Shrines not to Ammonius, nor to Osiris, Isis, or Ptah, but to a blazing disk, the Aten, the visible sun, a god stripped of myth and mystery, naked in its power. The priests of Ammonius whispered, then muttered, then raged. For every offering given to Aten was an offering denied to them. And this boy king, barely crowned, was already shifting the balance of heaven itself. Then came the art. For 3 millennia, kings had been carved as eternal ideals, square-shouldered, muscular, godlike. Now reliefs appeared of a thin, awkward figure with a swollen belly and drooping lips. His queen stood beside him, not as a distant symbol but as an equal, her hand brushing his, her face tender with love. And in their arms, daughters played beneath the outstretched rays of the sun, each ray ending in a tiny hand offering life. It was a vision of kingship that bared the private chamber to the world, a glimpse of intimacy where once only divinity had reigned. The queen's name was Nefertiti, beautiful, sharp-eyed, radiant. More than a consort, she was a partner in this revolution, a priestess who shared her husband's obsession. Together, they became living icons of a god no one had known before. Their images multiplied on walls, on temple gates, on scarabs and stelae, a family portrayed not in myth but in flesh, kissed by the sun itself. By his 5th year as pharaoh, the transformation was complete. Amenhotep IV shed the name of his fathers. He became Akhenaten, effective for the Aten. And with that renaming came a decision as audacious as it was irreversible. He would abandon Thebes, the holy city of Ammonius, and build a new capital, a city of light carved into the desert, dedicated to his one god alone. He called it Akhenaten, horizon of the Aten. The chisels that had once built monuments to Ammonius now cut stone for a god of fire and sky. And the priests who had once commanded half of Egypt's wealth found themselves watching a boy with strange eyes dismantle the world they ruled. Imagine entire civilizations being rewritten while you watch, and yet you almost let this story vanish into silence. Don't let it. Subscribe to Cursed Chronicles and keep these forbidden truths alive. The city rose from the desert like a vision. Where once there had been only bare sand and limestone cliffs, now avenues stretched wide and straight, palaces shimmered with painted walls, and colossal temples stood roofless beneath the sky. This was Akhenaten, horizon of the Aten, a city unlike any Egypt had ever known. Here there were no dark sanctuaries, no hidden chambers where only priests could whisper to the gods. The temples were open air, vast courtyards lined with rows upon rows of offering tables, all exposed to the burning gaze of the sun. At dawn, when the horizon bled with fire, the pharaoh and his queen stood bareheaded beneath the first rays, lifting bread and flowers to the disk. The priests chanted hymns not in shadowed halls but in blinding light, their voices rising with the heat. As the sun climbed, so too did the rhythm of devotion. Midday prayers, afternoon rituals, and evening laments as the gods sank behind the western cliffs. This was worship without secrecy, religion without myth. The Aten needed no statues, no myths of birth and death, no legends of battles with chaos. The Aten simply was, the source of all life, rising each day, setting each night, eternal in its fire. To some it was pure, to others it was empty. For the common people this new faith was strange and cold. Gone were the comforting gods who listened to prayers in sickness or grief. Isis no longer watched over mothers. Osiris no longer guided the dead. In their place was a blazing circle of light, distant and unapproachable. A god who gave life to all but promised nothing in return. Families whispered old prayers in private, hiding amulets of the banned gods beneath their clothes. Even as they stood in the courtyards to honor the Aten, they obeyed, but in their hearts they felt abandoned. Meanwhile, the pharaoh walked his new city as though it were paradise. His daughters ran through gardens watered by channels of Nile water. Foreign trees took root in desert soil, and painted walls showed lilies, birds, and endless sunlight. Here, Akhenaten believed, the world had been remade, Egypt cleansed of its past, reborn in the image of one god. But beyond the walls of Akhenaten, resentment stirred. Imagine entire generations erased from history, and you almost missed this story. Don't be the one who lets history vanish twice. Subscribe now. For all his power, for all his visions carved into stone and sunlight, Akhenaten faced a problem that gnawed at him like a curse. 6 daughters filled his palace halls, their names bound to the Aten, their lives painted on the walls as blossoms beneath the sun's rays. But there was no son, no heir to carry the revolution forward when his body finally yielded to time. In Egypt, the question of succession was never merely a family matter. It was the axis on which order turned, the guarantee that the Nile would keep flowing, that the gods would keep balance. Without a strong heir, the throne invited rivals, and with rivals came the threat of civil collapse. For Akhenaten it was more than politics. It was faith. His Aten was a jealous god, demanding a pure vessel, one utterly devoted, untainted by the old gods and their priesthood. The ordinary solutions of dynastic Egypt could not satisfy him. In ages past, pharaohs had married sisters, even half-sisters, to preserve divine blood. It was scandalous by later standards, but to the ancients, it was seen as a way to keep the royal line untouched. But Akhenaten pushed further. Where others had sought alliances, he saw only corruption. Where others had bent to political compromise, he saw betrayal of the Aten. And so he began to look inward, into his own household, at the daughters who bore the names of his god. To him, they were not merely children. They were living proof of the Aten's blessing, extensions of his own divine essence. If the Aten was father and mother of all creation, then surely its chosen king must mirror that cosmic unity. In his mind, there was no contradiction, only necessity. By wedding his daughters, he could fuse devotion, bloodline, and divinity into a single unbroken chain. What had once been an echo of tradition became a leap into the forbidden. Not just sibling unions, but father and child. Not whispered rumor, but ritualized arrangement. A union justified not by desire, but by a theology that twisted family into fate. It was here, in the shadows of Akhenaten, that the seeds of his darkest legacy took root. This is the kind of truth most people would rather not hear. But here you are, uncovering it with Cursed Chronicles. Don't just take, give back by subscribing. The change began almost imperceptibly, hidden in the details of temple walls. At first, it was Nefertiti who stood beside the pharaoh, her figure radiant in the rays of the Aten. But then, in newer reliefs, another woman appeared at his side. She was young, far younger than her mother had been, and her presence grew until it eclipsed even the once powerful queen. This was Meritaten, Akhenaten's eldest daughter, scarcely 16, yet adorned with the regalia of queenship. She took Nefertiti's place in ceremonies, receiving the life-giving rays of the sun disk as if she were no longer merely daughter but consort. Foreign diplomats began addressing her as queen, her name carved where once her mother's had stood. To the outside world, it was unprecedented. To Akhenaten, it was destiny. In his eyes, his child was not only blood of his blood but proof of divine favor, the living embodiment of Aten's will. But Meritaten was not the last. Soon, the king's gaze turned to her sister, Akhenaten, barely 13, still more child than woman. Yet in the rigid carvings of Akhenaten, she too began to appear beside her father, dressed in the robes of a queen, her small frame dwarfed by the regalia of a role she could never have chosen. The theology made it possible, even inevitable. If Aten was both father and mother, then the royal family, as its earthly mirror, must contain within itself all power to regenerate. To Akhenaten it was not violation but sacred duty. To the rest of Egypt, it was a line crossed into shadows even the ancients feared to tread. And then came tragedy. Meketaten, another daughter, was shown in the murals of the royal tomb not as a child playing in the sunlight, but as a figure collapsed upon a birthing bed. Around her stood attendants and mourners, and in the arms of a nurse, a newborn. She was gone before her life had scarcely begun, taken in childbirth, and the father of the child, whispered in the silence of history, may well have been her own father, the king himself. It was a truth too monstrous for scribes to record plainly, but the imagery etched into stone spoke louder than words. For the daughters of Akhenaten, there was no escape. They were daughters, then queens, then perhaps mothers of children bound in webs too tangled to name. Their childhoods were erased by the demands of theology, their identities consumed by their father's obsession. Imagine the psychological weight. To grow up cradled as a child beneath his hand, only to stand beside him as wife, forced to transform filial love into conjugal duty. What the murals portray as harmony was, in reality, a distortion that bent blood and affection into instruments of power. These were not unions of passion or even tradition. They were experiments in divine purity, carried out upon the bodies of children who had no voice but whose fates were written in stone. Beyond the painted walls of Akhenaten, the empire began to wither. Messages arrived from the north, clay tablets pressed with desperate words, the Amarna letters. Vassal kings in Syria and Canaan begged for soldiers, for archers, for Egypt's might to hold back the rising tide of enemies. Cities burned, allies defected, borders crumbled. And yet, the pharaoh's replies were few, often nothing more than vague promises. His mind was fixed not on battlefields but on hymns to the sun. The empire his father had ruled with iron and gold was unraveling. Once Egypt's name had carried terror from Nubia to the Euphrates. Now its vassals cursed their absent master. If the king does not send troops, one letter warned, all will perish. The cries echoed unanswered in Akhenaten's halls. Inside Egypt, the strain grew heavier still. The priests of Ammonius, stripped of their wealth, festered in silence, waiting for their moment. Farmers struggled as resources were drained to feed the new capital. Trade faltered, temples outside Akhenaten fell into ruin, and the economy cracked under the weight of a revolution that served only one god and one man. For the common people, faith itself felt stolen. No longer could they pray to Isis for protection, or Osiris for safe passage into the afterlife. No longer could they place offerings at the feet of familiar gods who had comforted generations. The Aten was a sun in the sky, distant, untouchable, indifferent to the sorrows of ordinary lives. What was divine purity to the king was emptiness to the people. And as Egypt's borders crumbled abroad, at home its soul withered in silence. The empire was bleeding, but in the gilded streets of Akhenaten, the pharaoh raised his face to the sun and called it paradise. You see how quickly a legacy can vanish when voices go silent? That's exactly what happens if you watch Cursed Chronicles without subscribing. If you choose not to join, don't just disappear. Say it in the comments. Let history judge your silence. In the 17th year of his reign, the sun set on Akhenaten for the last time. His death came without warning, leaving no grand funerary text, no triumphant farewell. Some whispered of illness, perhaps a wasting disorder that bent his body into strange proportions. Others spoke of the strain of his obsession, or of blood weakened by generations of inbreeding. The truth is lost, buried with a king who claimed to be both father and mother of creation, yet could not save himself. What followed was confusion. Power flickered like a dying flame, shifting hands in the shadows. Some say Nefertiti herself emerged as pharaoh under a new name, ruling briefly in the wake of her husband's death. Others point to a figure called Smenkhare, perhaps a brother, perhaps a son, perhaps even a mask worn by one of Akhenaten's daughters. The record is silent, as though Egypt itself wished to forget those years. And then a child king appeared. Tutankhaten, son of incest, born from a union never meant for the natural world, took the throne as a boy of 9. Around him gathered the old priests, the generals, the survivors of a wasted empire. In his hands, they placed not the blazing sun disk of his father, but the crook and flail of the ancient gods. His very name was changed. No longer Tutankhaten, but Tutankhamen, living image of Ammonius. The revolution of light was over. What followed was erasure. Akhenaten was abandoned to the desert, its temples left to crumble, its palaces stripped bare. Akhenaten's statues were smashed, his name gouged from stone, his images defaced until nothing remained but hollow outlines. Official lists of kings skipped his reign entirely, as though those 17 years had been a fever dream, a heresy better drowned in silence. The pharaoh who had once stood against 3,000 years of gods was condemned to the cruelest fate the ancients could imagine. To be forgotten, his memory starved of worship, his soul denied eternity. For more than 3,000 years, the desert kept its silence. The winds buried Akhenaten beneath sand, the stones of its temples stolen and repurposed, its name reduced to ash in memory. To the ancients, the erasure had been complete. But history has a way of refusing to die. In the 19th century, archaeologists stumbled upon the ruins of a city unlike any other in Egypt. Wide streets cut straight through the desert, broken columns rose in the open sky, and fragments of art revealed faces long vanished from the king lists. There he was again, Akhenaten, his strange, elongated features staring out of shattered reliefs, his family clustered around him in intimate scenes that no other pharaoh had dared to show. The heretic had returned, dragged back from oblivion by spades and dust. Piece by piece, scholars pieced together his forgotten revolution. The hymns to Aten, the letters of desperate vassals, the murals of daughters transformed into queens, all the fragments of a dynasty Egypt had tried to erase. And with the tools of modern science, even the bloodlines of his children gave up their secrets. DNA studies on mummies from the Valley of the Kings revealed what the ancients had hidden. Tutankhamun, the boy king who restored the old gods, was the son of incest. His parents' brother and sister, children of the same line that Akhenaten had twisted in the name of purity. His body bore the scars of it. Fragile bones, a clubbed foot, diseases that stalked him from birth. The dream of divine perfection had yielded a dynasty riddled with weakness, its heirs collapsing under the very blood that was meant to sanctify them. What priests had once erased with hammer and chisel, science now confirmed with strands of broken DNA. The shadows of Akhenaten's choices lingered not only in the ruins of his city, but in the bones of his children, preserved as warnings carved into flesh. The sound of chisels still echoes across the centuries. You can almost hear them in the silence of the ruins. Iron striking stone, erasing a name, grinding a face into dust. Once, it seemed his memory had been buried forever, condemned to vanish from both this world and the next. But time betrayed those who sought to silence him. The desert, though it swallowed his city, could not consume his story. Akhenaten rises again, not in temples or prayers, but in fragments of broken walls, in the bones of his children, in the questions that still haunt us. Was he a prophet, daring to glimpse a single god in the blazing sun when the world was not ready? Or was he a tyrant, blinded by his obsession, damning his own bloodline to suffering in pursuit of divine purity? Visionary or heretic, his fate was the same. Loved by none, erased by his people, remembered only by those who came after. You began this journey hearing the hammers strike, watching his name fall away into dust. And now, centuries later, you stand in the silence left behind, faced with a truth Egypt itself tried to bury, that even kings can be cursed, and sometimes it is the curse they carve upon themselves. You've just walked through the ashes of forbidden history with Cursed Chronicles. If you're still not subscribed, ask yourself, why carry this knowledge alone? Share the burden. Subscribe, or at least tell us where you watched from in the comments section.